ACEP is a university organization. We're a research group based out of the Institute of Northern Engineering, and we focus on energy questions and trying to make sure that we provide decision makers with the best information to make the best decisions. And that's decision makers all the way from our state representatives and governor, all the way to our folks that are homeowners making decisions. And so we put on this lecture series in hope to try and get some of that information to decision makers, and we're glad you're here. And if there are topics that you'd like to hear more about, please let us know. Next month in March, we're going to be doing something coinciding with the Tanana Chiefs Conference. They're doing their annual convention right around that time, and so we're going to be doing looking at different energy projects throughout the TCC region. So we hope that you will join us here at the Loon. As always, just a reminder to turn off your cell phones. I know they're ubiquitous nowadays, but if you could just either put them to vibrate so they don't disrupt, that would be great. And a big thanks to the Blue Loon. Every third Tuesday of the month, they don't show a movie, and they invite us all in instead. And so it's really great. In that vein, they do have a later show, so we do try to get out of here as close to 7:30 as we can in respect for that. So I just wanted to say thanks again to the Blue Loon. It's a really cool place to be able to listen to some energy information. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up Gwen Holdman. Gwen is the director of the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. Before that, she was the vice president of development at Sheena Hot Springs Resort, where she was part of the development of the first low-temperature geothermal power plant in the United States out there with Bernie Carl. And we're glad that she started this research group to try to look at the different questions that Alaska has, different barriers to industry development. And she was one of the folks that went on this policy tour in Iceland and sharing some lessons learned. So we're looking forward to hearing from her. Gwen.
All right, thank you. Julie mentioned that I worked at Sheena Hot Springs a few years back, and so really Iceland has been a place that has been on my bucket list of places to go to for a really long time. I've been very interested in geothermal development for Alaska and looking at what Iceland's done. It's a little bit different because they have much higher temperature resources there than we do, at least here in the interior, but I still was very interested in that model in terms of development. And so when we had the opportunity to participate in the Institute of the North organized Iceland policy tour, I jumped on that opportunity, but there's a lot of really amazing things that we've learned from that. And so that's really what today is about. It's talking a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned from Iceland, bringing that back, talking about where we went, but then also something that was really different this year is just spending a little bit of time having students work and delve more deeply into certain specific policy issues that we identified as being very interesting to us as Alaskans, where there might be analogies between Iceland and Alaska. And tonight, the students that participated in that policy tour, which were selected through a pretty competitive process, are going to be presenting some of the results of their analysis tonight for the first time. So we're excited. I'm excited to hear what they have to say. So I'm just going to give basically a little bit of background of the tour, why we selected Iceland, how the entire program really moved forward. Jason Meyer, who's our Emerging Energy Technology Grant Manager based in Anchorage for ACEP, he'll be speaking a little bit about some details about the tour, where we went, what we learned, and then the students are going to present the results from their policy papers. And then at the end, we'd like to come together and talk a little bit about the lessons that we learned from the experience. Why Iceland? This is an outcome of an initial policy tour that was completed in 2011 that actually went to Norway. And it was a group of legislators and business leaders and then the university that went over to Norway to look at information that we could glean from the Norwegian experience, especially around production of their oil and gas resources, tax structure, ownership issues, and things like that. And so that was a really enlightening tour. It was a whirlwind tour of the country. We learned a lot about the way they do things, what we might be able to use that we could apply here in Alaska, and why some things are different because we have a different set of circumstances here in the state. After that policy tour, we really looked at, boy, is there another country that we could have the same kind of experience, really spend some time and delve into understanding what their resources are, how they've developed them, why they might be different or similar than Alaska, what we could learn, and how we could apply that here. And there was pretty broad consensus that Iceland was another fantastic example because they're a fairly remote place in the world in terms of being at the end of supply lines like a lot of Alaska is. But at the same time, they've done a really amazing job at developing their local resources. And in their particular case, they didn't have any hydrocarbon resources to speak of. So they were really focused on developing their local resources, which were primarily geothermal and hydropower, both to serve the local population, but also really to find ways to develop new kinds of economic opportunities for Icelanders. And I think that's one thing that they've done very, very effectively, both in looking for ways that they can export their energy resources in ways other than through pipelines or through transmission lines. They've been really focusing on how can we do value-added processing of resources and then export that. And in the particular case of Iceland, what they've done is they have imported bauxite ore, which is generally mined in tropical areas of the world, imported that to Iceland, and they've refined that there and then exported that. There's a lot of energy that goes into developing a pound of aluminum, and that's why there's a big push to recycle aluminum products because it is such an energy-intensive process. And the industry is doing that because they can get long-term price contracts for electric power in Iceland because it's based on geothermal and hydropower resources. So once those projects are developed, there's a fairly understood cost structure associated with that, which I think we'll learn about a little bit more tonight. So this was a chance really for focused learning about a country with similar challenges to take back from Alaska. And I think that what you'll hear from the students when they talk today, it really takes going to a country and sitting down and asking the same questions over and over again and listening to answers and trying to correlate them and understand how it fits into a general understanding of what the situation is. That is really what's valuable about this process, not just looking at things on the internet, but really talking to residents and understanding and assimilating that information. How are things done differently in these other places? Again, this is really building on the Norway policy tour that took place. It was in 2011. So the student involvement opportunity was something that was really different this year from what we did in Norway. And I think this was a really fantastic opportunity. It was sponsored by the Institute of the North, by the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, and by UAF. And it was really an opportunity to incorporate, in this case, 4 graduate students from very different backgrounds that had very different experiences previous to going to Iceland in different areas of interest and focus, and get them to spend a little bit more time delving into a very specific and narrow set of challenges. And what we did is we spent a lot of time with these students. We had a mentor group, including myself, Jason Meyer, who's going to speak next, and Anthony Scott, who's also from UAF. He's in our Anchorage office. And we spent a lot of time with these students working out their policy questions and trying to refine how they were going to go about trying to answer this particular set of questions that we wanted to know a little bit more about. And this is something that I think really added a lot of depth to the conversation when we were over there. It was very well received. Here's a picture of the students and myself with President Grimson. We were able to have dinner at his house. And so, again, I think it really added a different element that everyone really appreciated. So here is kind of a list of some of the energy challenges, and some of these are just general challenges that we face in Alaska. High energy costs, this is not something that's a surprise to anyone here in the interior. Fragmented electric grid, we think about this a lot in rural Alaska, where we have all these communities that have very discontinuous electric grids that aren't connected to other places, but it's really a challenge for here in Fairbanks as well in a rail belt. We have similar kinds of challenges where our electric grid isn't connected to Canada. It's not connected to the lower 48. And so it creates some challenges for us that you don't necessarily see on a larger interconnected grid network like you see in the lower 48. Harsh climate, what was it today? 40 below zero. This is no surprise here. End of supply lines. This is a fact of Alaskan existence, and for a lot of our communities that are really dependent on barge shipments once a year or something like this, this is a real challenge. It's the same kind of thing in Iceland, where Iceland has really struggled in the past, especially during the world wars, where a lot of their shipments were cut off. And that actually created a lot of impetus for where they went with trying to get to greater energy security as a nation, because they realized their vulnerability in terms of international supply lines. Stranded resources. That's something we have here in Alaska. A lot of our resources, whether they're fossil-based or renewable, are not necessarily co-located with our population centers. We have a dispersed population. Granted, we have most of the population in Anchorage and Fairbanks and Juneau, but we have a lot of people in very small communities around the state, and Iceland's not dissimilar in that way. We have a centralized economy here, and really based on a few particular things, and then here in Alaska, we have a diverse culture. There are some areas where we have similarities with Iceland, including harsh climate, end of supply lines, stranded resources, dispersed population, and a centralized economy. But there's also areas where we're very different. And one is high energy costs. Iceland has a different energy cost structure than we do here, and we'll learn a little bit more about that. Fragmented electric grid. One thing that was interesting, after the end of this policy tour, I actually traveled to some of the more outlying areas of Iceland. In fact, some of the areas that don't have access to geothermal, because I was really interested to see if there were differences in the way people lived their lives there, in the terms of ideas that they had about how the country was being developed. And I learned a few things on that trip, which I was the only one that participated in from the group. And one was that Iceland doesn't have a fragmented electric grid. Even their most remote farms and the most remote far-flung places in the country have generally at least seasonal road access and electric power year-round. There's almost nowhere in the country that doesn't have access to those things on a national grid. And so that's something that's interesting. They've really invested in a national grid infrastructure going to almost every single farm in the country. And secondly, culturally, they are not very diverse. You know, the people in the more rural areas of the country are Icelanders, and they have the same kind of history as people living in Reykjavik. And so they have very aligned ideas. And so as a country, this is my observation, and I don't want to get it too far ahead in terms of lessons learned, but they're much more homogenous in terms of their history, their ideas about how the country should be moving forward, and how that should happen. So in 1901, just giving just a little bit of background on Iceland as a country, the per capita national input in income or output was very, very similar to the GDP, about the same as today's Ghana. They were dependent on one major industry, that was fishing. They imported coal for heating. They were totally dependent on imported fossil fuels, especially since they'd essentially cut down every tree in the country. There were no trees left in Iceland at that time. And the island was really environmentally decimated. So, and that's something that Icelanders take pretty seriously. Here's a picture of Reykjavik in 1932. Again, all the buildings were heated with coal. Doesn't look that dissimilar from downtown Fairbanks on a bad day, right? But Iceland today, you know, they've really turned things around. And I don't have updated numbers since the banking crisis, but their estimated GDP per capita was $58,000 in 2008. That was shortly before the banking crisis, so that's gone down a little bit. It ranks third in the world in the United Nations Human Development Index, so it's a pretty good place to live. And only 18% of their total energy need is imported, and that's primarily diesel fuel to support transportation and especially the fishing industry. And it took Iceland just 100 years, which is 3 generations, to become one of the world's most affluent countries. So the question is, in my mind, before we went to Iceland, is how did they do that? You know, what kind of policies did they put in place? What mechanisms did they use to move forward from this pretty impoverished European outpost to becoming one of the most modern and wealthy countries in the world? And so here's a picture of Reykjavik today. It's one of the cleanest cities in the world. It's heated off of geothermal energy. But the interesting thing is that they learned about geothermal energy by coming to the United States. They actually went to Boise, Idaho. It's one of the oldest district heating systems in the world. A lot of the knowledge that they gained was really from the U.S., but they've applied it there and taken it to another level and really now become the world experts in this particular technology area. And that's all of my presentation. So I'm going to bring Jason up here to talk a little bit more about some of the specifics of the tour.
Thank you very much, Glenn. So I'm going to walk through some of the energy elements we learned during the trip. There's a lot of information we learned, so I'm really going to probably do it injustice here and kind of summarize a lot of it. But we're hoping during the Q&A afterwards, if anything piques your interest, that you'll feel free to ask us more about it. After I'm done speaking, we're going to bring up the students. Each one of them is going to present on their specific policy research. Chris Pike, one of our students, is actually based in North Carolina. He'll be presenting a podcast. We'll show that. So this is an outline of many of the organizations we met with. It was really a mix of government entities, politicians, the president himself, various ministers. We met with many municipalities, the energy offices, private developers. It was really a mix of basically the whole spectrum of people involved in energy. Not only energy, we looked at things like agriculture, fishing, but the primary focus was energy. We met with folks from the university. We went and toured various projects around the country, which we'll get into. But really, it was a no holds barred trip over a couple short days. This is a map of the. One thing I wanted to mention. Gwen really mentioned a lot of these in-depth conversations we had. I think this is a really important note where, in my experience, Icelanders are very candid. They're very approachable. They can really, they really speak their mind. And so it was really interesting to be able to engage them and really learn some candid information that you might not learn from other government officials in other countries. So that was actually very valuable, I think, for a lot of the students in particular. The other thing was the language barrier. English is prevalent in the country. The U.S. and others have had a presence historically in the country for a while. So there was very limited language barrier, and then also the approachability of many of the people in the country really facilitated a lot of these discussions and visits that we had. This is a map of the island. One thing I wanted to point out, Gwen mentioned visiting one of the more remote areas of the island, and that would be this upper peninsula here. The majority of the population is based down in this area with Reykjavik, and there's one main road called the Ring Road that travels all the way around, basically following the path of the transmission line. A lot of these coastal communities are historically fishing communities, but many of the population is focused down in Reykjavik. And to give you a perspective of where it's located globally, this is a top-down view from the North Pole. It's really critical, I think, to think about Iceland in terms of its global position in the Arctic. And that's really what Iceland thinks of themselves as kind of this emerging Arctic, key Arctic player. You look at things like trans-Arctic shipping, they're really kind of one of the main gateways toward the Arctic, Alaska being on the other end. So we had a lot of conversations just based on that, kind of our joint shared experience in the Arctic and our positions and such. Some numbers for you. These are updated as of 2011. The population of Iceland is about 320,000 compared to Alaska, 722,000. The GDP, as Gwen mentioned, has recently gone down due to the banking crisis. It's about 38,000 compared to 65 in Alaska. The installed generating capacity, 2,579 megawatts compared to the total for Alaska. And I think it's important to realize the difference in population. So just as a note, if you go down, what's particularly striking is the mix of energy, the portfolio energy that is used in the country. In Alaska, we use a lot of oil, we use a lot of coal, natural gas. In Iceland, it's almost strictly hydro and geothermal, and we'll show some more slides on that. As we talk about some of the energy elements of the country, I think it's important to think about these three themes, and these are some of my personal takeaways, lessons learned, but not to get too ahead of myself. But I think for me, it's really enlightening to think about these three lenses as we discuss some of their energy infrastructure. First one is identifying comparative advantages. This is something Iceland intentionally does. What are their comparative advantages that they can really capitalize? The second is strategic long-term thinking. That was really striking for me, that Iceland has a very long view of time and interest in investment and capital improvement and economic development. The third one is investment. They're very intentional and strategic about investment in country for returns. People, institutions, infrastructure. These three themes really repeated themselves over and over and over again during our trip. In terms of the energy mix, 80% of the primary energy supply comes from renewable resources, hydro and geothermal, 99.9% of electricity production, 99% of space heating. There are only two communities not on that major national grid, and they're both islands, one north and one south of the main island. They're both fishing communities, and they're similar here where they're based on diesel generation. The remaining 20% of their energy portfolio comes from imported fossil fuels, but this is primarily for transportation, in particular their shipping fleet. So that's just another interesting element, I think, of their portfolio mix. This is another map of Iceland with the grid superimposed. As you can see, it is far-reaching. It basically goes everywhere in the country. The two areas not on the map, there's an island up here, and then one down here, two fishing communities that serve as major ports for some of their fishing fleets. What's noticeable is the position of things like smelters. There's one of the Fjarðaál, one of the major smelters we visited, is actually located over here, and a lot of the transmission comes from the Kárahnjúkar Dam, which is located here. Another major location of some of their renewable resources, their hydro, is in this area, in geothermal. And you'll notice that some of their other industrial loads based here, and this is Reykjavik. Specific to geothermal energy, this is a historic graph of its use for space heating. As Gwen mentioned, 1901, heavily coal dependent, which was slowly transitioned to oil, and that was slowly phased in with electricity, and then eventually phased out completely with geothermal. And geothermal is used for many applications beyond just space heating. Electricity production. We visited the world's second largest geothermal plant, for instance. Swimming pools. One of the lessons for me was swimming is the national pastime of Iceland. I mean, who knew? But you go to any community, large or small, there is a swimming pool, and there are the series of hot tubs, ranging from somewhat warm all the way to scalding. And it's wonderful. Snow melting, industry, fish farming, greenhouses. Fish farming and greenhouses, they're really looking to diversify their energy applications, right? So really diversify their industry portfolio. Things like greenhouses, fish farming, these are areas that they're starting to delve into, seeing if it's something that can really be successful for them. But they are really expanding their application of their geothermal energy. This is a layout of the second largest geothermal plant, Helsinki geothermal plant, 303 megawatt electricity, and then 133 megawatt hot water. This hot water is piped, I think it was 70 kilometers. It was pretty far distance, all the way to Reykjavik, where it's added to their district heating, swimming pool heating, and other uses. So they really do holistic energy development there, electricity, heating production, and then they look for alternative uses for that product as well. Just a brief overview of the electricity profile from 2010. On the installed capacity, you can see fuel 121 megawatts. It really is a minor element of their total installed capacity. And on the generation side, you can really see that's even less in terms of its overall contribution to the overall electricity production. For me, this bottom graph is really one of the major lessons learned, the summary for me. When we in Alaska talk about, energy infrastructure and something like Susitna Dam and energy projects in Anchorage or Fairbanks, we're really talking about ways to reduce energy costs or expand generation capacity for end users. When Iceland talks about electricity production, they've already addressed their domestic needs. They're talking about industry development. Currently, 73% of their electricity consumption goes strictly to the aluminum industry. And this is something they're actively increasing. They're looking at greenhouses, they're looking at data centers, they're looking at other energy intense end users, really looking to develop their energy resources specifically for energy intense industry, some form of economic development. Residential consumption, 5% of their total electricity production. This is an image of the Kárahnjúkar hydropower plant. This is one of the projects we visited in eastern Iceland, just a really mind-blowing visit just in terms of the scale and scope. The power plant itself is actually drilled into the mountainside. It's like visiting a secret base from a evil villain. It's pretty striking. Well, actually, Dominique Pride's actually going to be presenting on this project a lot more. 690 megawatts installed capacity. Almost all of this power goes directly to an aluminum smelter. Very little of it actually goes to the major grid in Iceland. This is the end use, the smelter itself, the Fjarðaál aluminum smelter. This was an immense, massive industrial complex, even much bigger than some of the industrial complexes on the North Slope. We were trying to get a sense of how this plays in the global aluminum market, and it was roughly 1% of total global aluminum production. So you think about the amount of these plants just internationally, globally situated, and just the energy it takes to produce aluminum, and how much goes into that as an industry as a whole. As Gwen mentioned, the bauxite, the product that goes into aluminum is shipped from Brazil or from other more tropical locations, Australia historically, and it's with the use of electricity converted into their final product. They make ingots and sheet aluminum and other products that go into automobile industry and other things. To give you a sense of the overall exports of Iceland, roughly, I feel comfortable with this. This is from one of the ministry presentations, so this is how they present their exports. So exactly 25% goes into the energy-intense industry. Historically, fishing was their main area of economic focus, and that's probably roughly 25% as well. Transportation and travel, another 25%. Iceland Air is opening a branch in a flight in Anchorage, direct flight in Anchorage starting in May. They're really aggressive in terms of expanding a lot of the transportation and tourism opportunities to Iceland. Just a really interesting business model in terms of how they're shifting passengers from Europe to America and back again, using Iceland as their central hub. And then 25% for other. One of the days we got to visit one of a data center that's recently opened up in Iceland. Data centers, obviously you need energy, but you also need connectivity. They have a very strong connection, data connection to Europe, and also a connection to the North America. It's not as reliable, so a lot of their traffic is primarily to Europe. But this is an industry that Iceland is acutely focused on, just given its need for electricity. But also not only electricity, but clean electricity. A lot of the data companies are under heavy pressure for green portfolios. In the US, a lot of data centers are located on rivers. The Columbia River Gorge, for instance, is the Columbia River area is one area where there's a lot of data centers. So going back to my three lenses, this was a result of various meetings with ministers in terms of Icelandic energy planning. They really do comprehensive energy strategy for Iceland. They have a very holistic, very strategic approach to how they're going to be developing their resources and infrastructure in the future. Having renewable energy resources replace imported energy. For them, it's really now a focus on transportation. They've been looking at things like, and historically looking at hydrogen vehicles. Now they're more looking, I think, towards electric vehicles. That's something they're very interested in. So I think in the future, that's an area that they're going to be spending a lot of time on, trying to address their dependence on imported fossil fuel for their transportation sector. Supporting diversified industry. Their one-trick pony is aluminum. Well, it's not their only thing, but it's a major contributor to their overall economic profitability. They are looking to diversify that. There is a lot of danger being hitched to one primary economic driver. Aluminum is actually facing a lot of competition with new innovations in carbon fiber, other materials. So they are looking at things again like greenhouses, data centers, other areas of opportunity to be utilizing their energy. They have a precautionary and protective approach to energy production. The last major project that was built, the Kárahnjúkar Dam, which Dominique will present on, It wasn't developed without controversy. There is impact on the local geography and some of the bird nesting areas and fish runs and such. And I think that project in particular really spurred a very, not contentious, but a very spirited debate, as far as debates go in Iceland, about how they develop future projects. That project was, again, almost specifically built to feed an aluminum smelter. And so there is a lot of debate, I think, in how they develop some of their other renewable energy resources in a more maybe holistic manner. This has all resulted in a master plan for utilization of renewable energy resources. This is a plan that's been in the making, I think, for about 10 years now. We were actually there, I think, the day before it was finalized or released, which was actually pretty timely. So we got to talk to several of the ministers and other people about this plan. They've gone through the entire country and identified their sites that could feasibly produce commercial scale energy, primarily geothermal and hydro. And there's 80 of them, and they're all over the country. And they have a very complex way of assessing these sites based on economic development, based on location, based on potential environmental impact. A very complex decision matrix, which I think we could really learn from here, anywhere, really. And they've created these three categories: green, red, and yellow, in terms of, should we think about developing this? Red, no. Yellow, let's wait and see. Green, let's do some preliminary work. Again, when they're looking at developing energy resources, it's almost specifically for energy end users, commercial energy industry. But not only that, it's a strategic means of economic development, regional economic development. So the smelter I introduced in the beginning is located in the Far East, which is an area that's has a lot more poverty and a lot less jobs and opportunity than Reykjavik. That project was built there, one, for the deep port location, two, because of the resources close by, but three, because they really needed some type of economic opportunity in that area. It was amazing to see the management at the company. It was an Alcoa facility. When they identified it as a place for a future Alcoa plant, they immediately hired a team of local managers, and those managers worked with Alcoa in terms of developing the facility, the work culture, everything around the local population. I think it employs, forget, 300, 700 people. It's maybe 300. But in terms of the size of the community, it plays a profound effect in terms of deployment. And the workers were, from my experience, very happy of being there. Very glad of the opportunity that was generated. It wasn't like a depressing company town. There's a ski resort, within you could see it actually from the plant. So it was just a very interesting, intentional method of utilizing stranded resources for regional economic development. What I'd like to do now is bring up the students. Each of them, again, had a specific topic area that we thought was very relevant to Alaska and informative to the legislature here in Alaska. The topics ranged from district heating in Reykjavik, geothermal development and knowledge economy, the Kárahnjúkar project, which I've spoken a little bit on, and food security. So each student's going to come up, present themselves, and discuss their topics. After they're done, I believe we're all going to come up and do just kind of a general lessons learned session, but we'd really like to do Q&A, unless there's one pressing question. Maybe something. I'll check on that while the students are up here. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. So with that, I'm going to bring up Dominique Pride.
Hi, like Jason said, my name is Dominique Pride, and I chose the topic of the Hydroelectric project, which Jason did a little bit of introduction on. And the reason I was interested in this is because it's about the same size as the Susitna-Watana, the proposed Susitna-Watana. And so I was interested in what Alaska could take away from Iceland. So what exactly is it? It was a $1.1 billion project, and it was constructed from 2003 to 2009, and it's located in the remote highlands of East Iceland. It's owned and operated by Iceland's state electric company. So they have a state-owned electric company, and it's Landsvirkjun. And this project, while the biggest dam is the Kárahnjúkar Dam, it's actually a series of 5 dams, and it harnesses 2 glacial rivers, and these 5 dams create 3 reservoirs. And from these 3 reservoirs, there are 43 miles of tunnels that lead to the underground power station. So this is a huge undertaking. And the capacity is 690 megawatts installed capacity. And almost all this electricity goes to the Alcoa Fjordal smelter. A very small percentage gets fed into the national grid. And this is important because they have a 40-year contract with Alcoa. And in the contract, there's a take-or-pay stipulation. So 85% of the electricity that was specified in the contract, Alcoa is required to either take and use, or they have to pay for it either way. And this plays an important role in mitigating the risk for Iceland, for the state-owned electricity company. And it's also important to point out that the government of Iceland actually underwrites all of the loans that Landsvirkjun, all the debt that they issue. The government of Iceland indirectly underwrites their loans. Okay, so there are a lot of similarities with the Susitna-Watana. Like I mentioned, they're a similar size. The proposed Susitna-Watana would have an installed capacity of 600 megawatts, whereas the Kárahnjúkar was 690. They're both located, the project sites are in subarctic climates. They have rough weather in remote locations, and their roads had to be built to the project site in Iceland, like the roads that have to be built in Alaska. And they're both on glacially fed rivers, so that kind of complicates things because there's a lot of sediment in the water. And as Jason pointed out earlier, they were both subject to environmental protests. And I think that more so in Iceland than here in Alaska, because the region where it was built, the highlands in eastern Iceland, was actually the second largest wilderness area in Europe, behind Svalbard in Norway. And so a lot of people in the western, more populated area of the country were against this. But in the area where it was built in East Iceland, it had a lot of local support. The people there really needed jobs. And so they actually supported it. So there are some similarities between the projects, but they're really not that similar when you look at the environment. The major differences, I would say the biggest difference is actually the purposes for construction. With the Kárahnjúkar plant, it was more of a social project. The government wanted to build have an industrial facility come in to provide jobs for East Iceland. So they incentivized this facility to come in by building this large hydroelectric project that would provide it with low-cost electricity. And in turn, East Iceland got about 700 jobs from Alcoa and jobs surrounding Alcoa, service jobs for the Alcoa smelter. And the purpose of the Susitna Dam is to meet the mandate for 50% renewable electricity, to stabilize electricity prices on the rail belt, and then eventually, in the long run, reduce electricity prices over what they would be. So they have very different purposes. Project costs. The Kárahnjúkar plant only cost $1.1 billion. Only $1.1 billion. But the most recent estimate, Alaska Energy Authority's most recent estimate for the Susitna-Watana is $5.19 billion. So that's considerably more expensive, which really adds to the risk. But one of the reasons that Kárahnjúkar was cost so little to build was because the Icelandic currency was very strong when Landsvirkjun issued the first tranche of debt with their bond. Power purchasers, like we mentioned earlier, Alcoa is pretty much the only person buying electricity from the Kárahnjúkar plant. They have a long-term, very secure contract that's linked to the price of electricity, or not electricity. The electricity price is linked to the price of aluminum. So, I mean, there is some volatility in that, but because they have the take or pay stipulation in the contract, no matter what, Alcoa is on the hook to pay for 85% of their contracted power. Whereas in Alaska, the negotiations would have to take place between the 6 small rail belt utilities. So that makes the process a little more complicated for the power sales agreement. Because you go, in Iceland, they had 1 buyer, whereas in Alaska, we would have 6. And then also, the financing is probably going to be quite different. Landsverken issued general debt. It was not project-specific debt, whereas if we were to build something in America, you would usually see a project-specific debt for something that costs a lot of money. You would create a subsidiary, and then only, like, if the project lost money, then the subsidiary would be on the hook, but not the parent company. But that's not what Landsverken did. They issued general debt, which would be akin to the state of Alaska issuing general obligation bonds. But we really can't compare the financing between the 2 projects because actually the Alaska Energy Authority has not announced how they plan on funding the Susitna Dam yet, but I'm sure it won't be anything like how Landsverken did it. And also it's important to point out once again that the state or the national government of Iceland underwrites Landsverken's loans, and I can't see the U.S. government underwriting our loans for So lessons that I took away from this is that Iceland's anchor client model, with Alcoa being the anchor client, really doesn't fit for the Susitna-Watana. They're really not comparable. However, this model could be used for development of some of the stranded renewables that have been looked at throughout the state. And this is a nice model to use, the anchor client model, because your anchor client actually ends up shouldering a portion of the risk from the project. Like Alcoa shouldered a lot of the risk of the Kárahnjúkar project. And another important thing to take away is that the power sales agreement should really be in place before any big money starts to get spent. And they did this in Iceland. They made sure that everything was signed, sealed, and delivered before they broke ground on the project. Whereas with the Bradley Lake project, actually construction was held up for almost a year in the middle of construction because there were still negotiations going on with the power sales agreement, and that actually really increases the cost of the project. So I think the state should, a big takeaway is that the state should make sure that the power sales agreement is in place before construction begins. And actually, I'm going to ask the poll questions to the end. And I do believe Josh Miller is going to come up now and tell us a little bit about his project.
Okay. I'm Josh Miller. I'm a graduate student at UAS in the geology department. And what I'm going to talk about today, Iceland's domestic resource knowledge economy as a model, and how can we apply that to Alaska in development of our own alternative and renewable energy sources. And so when I mention a knowledge economy, what that actually means is I'm referring to knowledge as capital, in this case, to meet business goals. And that capital includes the expertise that's gained through resource development, so research and development, education, and professional experience. So how they apply that,
Josh,
develop a resource.
Can you work that mic a little closer? I'm not picking you up.
Is that better?
Better.
Okay, sorry. So how do we use that experience that's gained through resource development, turn that into capital to further develop more resources and eventually make money?
And so, really quickly, I noticed, and so kind of to go off what Gwen said, it is really important to go there in the first place, really talk to them face to face, figure all of this out, and really get their opinion about it. But also another important aspect of that is you get to hear from different organizations, different people with different experiences, and hear what they each say that overlaps. So you get to hear what's important, and it's usually repeated from each organization, from each person. So it's important to take what they think is important, consolidate it. So that's what I attempted to do when looking at this model and seeing how we can apply it to Alaska. And so when I try to identify what are the main drivers for the success, and that is how did they go from, as Gwen mentioned early on, from disrupted fossil fuel sources and eventually becoming a world leader in geothermal development. What were some of the mechanisms for that? And I actually got to voice that to the president of Iceland personally, and he said, well, quite frankly, it was to make money. So building off of that and starting roughly in the 70s and 80s, they started to develop their niche, and that is geothermal and hydropower. So given the lack of domestic petroleum resources and this abundance in geothermal and hydropower, they took it upon themselves to develop the expertise, that knowledge capital, to become successful. And to do that, you have industry, that's private exploration companies, government, so the National Energy Authority, other agencies, and universities where people are trained and educated in geothermal development to collaborate and work with one another to establish this knowledge economy. There is one limitation to that, and that's the human capital. That is, you have to have people to make this successful. And that's one of the limitations in Iceland, with a population, as they put it, less than 1 million people. So that's definitely the common denominator when looking at this model. And then at the end, I'd like to suggest a few recommendations on how we can apply that model to Alaska's own alternative renewable resource knowledge economy. To try to make this a little bit easier to understand, there's a lot of parts to this, is just the abbreviated form of the Icelandic model for their domestic resource knowledge economy. So to start off, you have the National Energy Authority. If you were to make comparison to Alaska, that would be, say, Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. So you have this energy authority that's collecting, amassing all data that's gathered in exploration and development within Iceland, and they make that widely available to private industry. You also have the Iceland Geosurvey, which is a self-financed government agency that has a lot of, that provides well support to a lot of exploration within Iceland. They also have a lot of equipment they provide. They also have the professional services they can give to private exploration companies. And then within that, you have other private companies, Reykjavik Geothermal being an example. And so what's important is that these, the government and the private industry can collaborate and work together. And so that kind of goes back to what Jason was talking about, the master plan, to establish which resources are best suited for immediate development, which ones need further consideration, and which ones don't need to be developed for environmental concerns. So this actually invites private industry and exploration. So what you have there, this collaboration in government and private industry, is then fed into institutional training. And that includes different training programs to bring students from either within Iceland or worldwide and train them. And this collaboration with the government and private industry provides resources, funding, and professional support. You have people with the expertise come in and train students on applied and actual realistic real-world problems and how to deal with them in exploration and development. In particular, the UNU, so the University or United Nations University Geothermal Training Program. Now, this training program invites students from worldwide, mostly from underdeveloped countries, that have geothermal resources and the potential for development, and trains students over the course of 6 months from a wide range of subjects. It includes geoscience, engineering to business. And they train them how to go back home and develop these resources. And so what Iceland is actually doing is bringing people in, turning them into experts, sending them back to their home country. And this is nucleating these different resources and potential further development from Iceland to go out and develop these sites. So they're really expanding the market and making future projects for themselves. And then included in that are some of the renewable energy programs in Iceland. So throughout Iceland, they have a lot of training programs that are available to students, usually as a 1-year or as a master's program, to train them in alternative renewable energy development. And so you have this institutional training. Now you feed that into the knowledge economy, and this is where you get all the benefits. You have a highly qualified domestic workforce. So you're really concreting your future geothermal and hydropower infrastructure within the country. You're also developing international resource development. So like I said, UNU, GTP, you're developing your training students and sending them back out. You're opening this worldwide market. So you're expanding the market. And really the main goal is for Iceland to become this worldwide geothermal hub for geothermal exploration and development, much like Houston is for petroleum resources. And what I could really do is take this knowledge economy and I could draw an arrow to go right back to the beginning, because the benefits of this knowledge economy model feed right back to the beginning, where you're taking these trained professionals within Iceland and putting them right back in the National Energy Authority, the Geosurvey, and other private industry. So what can I say about the application of this model to Alaska? First off, I would recommend, based on Iceland's experience, a pre-development plan or a master plan for Alaska. And this is for the geothermal, hydro resources, and other alternative renewable resources, to invite private industry to make these resources, basically put them on a list, say which ones are ready to go, to do the environmental impact assessment early on. And so that way it's easier to invite more private industry exploration. And next, promote the collaboration between industry and educational institutions. So private exploration with universities such as UAF for both the applied and basic research. So we have the alternative and renewable energy focused courses, or you could establish these kind of courses within the university. And with that, you have professionals from industry coming in to teach people about on-site experience, and give them that industry-focused training so that you have the academic understanding, but also the real-world understanding as well. And this hopefully could attract more in-state, national, and international students. And hopefully the end goal would be not only to develop these resources and have a strong knowledge economy in Alaska. Hopefully, side benefit would be you could extend the stay of the average Alaskan resident longer than 7 years. All right, well, that's the end of mine. So thank you.
My name is Julie Emsley, and I actually just graduated last semester from UAF with my master's in rural development, and I received that through UAF's Peace Corps Master's International Program. I also work as a project manager for FEDC, Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation, and at FEDC, one of the projects I oversee is our agriculture project, and through our agriculture project, we try our best to help grow and develop our agricultural industry here in the interior of Alaska, as well as addressing our food security needs. So I was assigned with looking at food security in Iceland as it compares to Alaska. So today I'm just going to briefly, in the short time that I have, talk about what food security is, how Iceland roughly compares to Alaska, and some of the mechanisms or main contributors that have led to Iceland's current level of food security. So just briefly, what is food security? Well, food security can be divided up into three main pillars. And those three are food availability, food access, and food utilization. Food availability is just that. That's having enough food supply on a consistent or regular basis. Access is having the resources needed and available to get the food that is available. So, for example, in Fairbanks, we could have all the food that we would ever need to survive. However, if we can't afford to buy it, we lack food access. The last one is utilization, and this has more to do with being able to appropriately use food to meet our nutrition needs and to eat it in a healthy way. So things like water and sanitation are things that are taken into consideration with food utilization. And addressing food security in general in a region or an area, we look at these three pillars and try to determine the stability of those three pillars. So, for example, we might have food access, availability, and utilization here in Fairbanks today, but is it susceptible to disruption or changes, any fluctuation? And so many believe that our current food system, not just in Alaska, but in much of the world, is currently very unstable, largely due to the fact that we have our food comes from very far away. So in the lower 48, the average bag of groceries travels 1,500 miles before it gets to a kitchen table. In Alaska, it's estimated that it's twice that high. Because of that food supply system can be easily fluctuated. It can also be disrupted, whether that's through environmental impacts or natural disasters, as well as that imported food supply is highly reliant on cheap fossil fuels. As a result, to address food security, most areas and regions are shifting from a conventional food supply system that we currently have, where food is coming from long distances away, to an integrated food system where more food is produced locally. So therefore, to bring it all together, today, food security is highly tied, very largely tied with a region or an area's ability to produce its own food. So just looking very, very briefly at Alaska and comparing it to that of Iceland, food production in Iceland is roughly at 50% of what the food that is consumed. So Iceland is able to currently produces all of the dairy, meat, eggs, and fish that they need, and 50% of their vegetables. They are very dependent on imports of grain and sugar, fruit, and the remaining 50% of vegetables. However, when we take into consideration Alaska, they're doing pretty well, because Alaska, it's estimated that we roughly import about 98% of our food. These numbers, I will have to say that they are hard to know the accurate and real hard data both in Iceland and Alaska, but most experts agree that these are pretty close if they're not right on. So this number too, it should be pointed out that this includes our hunting and fishing, gathering, foraging, and gardening that's part of our Alaskan lifestyle. And just to kind of illustrate that more clearly, there was a study done at UAF recently, and it showed that annually 85% of our red meat from hoofed animals comes from outside of the state. In Iceland, there's about 3,200 farms, and that's about roughly 6% of the population. Alaska, we have about 700 farms, and that's roughly 0.1% of the population. It should also be noted that in Iceland, most farmers, that's their sole source of income, whereas in Alaska, it's very rare to find farmers that's their only occupation or the only source of income. So in looking at this, lastly, it was really important for me to try to assess why this is the case. How come food security seemed to be so much better in Iceland than it was in Alaska? And it seemed like overall in my interactions and conversations, as well as my research, that it just seemed like this was something that was important, both on a government level and on a public level. And so looking at some of the things that the government has in place to support their agricultural system and their food system, the food system, the agriculture is subsidized pretty heavily, especially on milk and sheep. And the milk receives a 34% subsidy, and sheep receive the 44% subsidy. And there are a couple other products that do receive a small subsidy. Going along with this, the other piece of their support system from the government is that there are import duties on a variety of products. I have them listed on the screen. Of course, this helps to make products that are produced locally more competitive. And then lastly, the government is very supportive of the Farmers Association of Iceland. And that association provides a variety of services, both to farmers and to people throughout the ag industry, as well as they work with the government to make sure that policies are in place to help keep food security in the forefront. So, as I said, it seemed that this wasn't just something that was happening at a top-down level. When I spoke with people in Iceland, whether it was at the grocery store or those working or farmers, it seemed like overall that Icelanders were very aware of the importance of having a local food supply. And so one of the members that I was working with the Farmers Association, I asked him at one point, knowing that he had an understanding of our situation of Alaska and was really working hard on this in Iceland, what were the main reasons that he felt that this seemed to be the case. And he felt that there was so much public support because, to quote him, he said, it's part of our character. He said, we want to be independent. Due to our isolation and history, we know that we can be cut off. Therefore, we have a strong public support of these issues. And I wanted to point out, that it's not just past wars or whatnot that have affected the importance of food security in Iceland, but recent events have also happened, most notably the 2008 financial crisis, in which the imports were shut off for a brief period of time. And so Icelanders are very aware of the fact of how their food supply system could be so easily jeopardized. And when you can't access the things that you normally do, food is one of the things that comes to the top of the list. And then lastly, one of the other ones is the volcanic eruptions that happened in 2010 and 2011. And those also made clear to Icelanders how their food supply can also be jeopardized. So there's many other contributors that I found, of course, but I felt that these were the most, these seemed to stick out the most in what I was doing. So thanks. Oh, and I think Chris is next. So let me see if I can find his video presentation.
Hello, my name is Chris Pike, and I had the privilege of traveling to Iceland with the Institute of the North last November, and I was taking a look at the policies and mechanisms that made the district heating system in Reykjavik so successful. So just some background here. This is a simple schematic on the district heating system. And there's really two types of resources that they use. There's a low temperature resource, which you see there on the top left, where water is pumped directly out of the geothermal wells and delivered to the consumers for domestic hot water and space heating. And there on the bottom you see a high temperature resource where water is pumped from the geothermal well, and because there's a bunch of chemicals in that water, it's run through a heat exchanger which heats water from a cold water well, and then that is actually what's delivered to the consumers. There's several things that happen to the water once it's been used by consumers. In some cases, it's run through snow melting infrastructure, and they melt snow on the roads with it. After that, it just goes straight into the sewer like any other wastewater. Some of the water is actually recirculated and remixed in the system as well. Some background information on Reykjavik. It's located at latitude 64 with an average January low temperature of 27 degrees. Coal was rationed during World War I. That was also some of the coldest winters on record, and that was really the motivation for investigating an alternative source of heat. When they first began installing the geothermal district heating in 1928, it serviced a school, a hospital, and about 60 homes. The expansion of that system continued, and it actually had a big expansion immediately after World War II, and by 1961, over half the population of Reykjavik was served by the district heating infrastructure. Today, nearly all the buildings in Reykjavik are serviced by that infrastructure, and it's really a national source of pride. Reykjavik Energy is a municipally owned utility there, And in addition to delivering hot water, they also provide cold water, electricity, sewage, and fiber optic services to the residents. So taking a look at some of the mechanisms that made that change possible, as I said before, they were reliant on a non-domestic fuel source, and in addition to that, it was really causing a lot of pollution. And you can see there in the picture on the top right, there was this black cloud that came to be pretty common over Reykjavik. And they realized that they had this world-class resource and that they should utilize that. So Icelanders are very entrepreneurial people, and they're not afraid to take some risks. And so they developed this district heating system. In the early days, according to many Icelanders, connection to the district heating system was actually mandatory. And as you can imagine, this caused a lot of political tension. And during every election, people talk about how district heating was always a very big issue. After the 1970s oil crisis and the rise in price of petroleum, that political debate, of course, quieted down by quite a bit. The other thing that Reykjavik has been able to do is really take advantage of the economies of scale. As I showed in the previous slide, Reykjavik Energy does more than just deliver heat with the district heating system. And in addition, they deliver heat not just to Reykjavik, but to several of the small outlying communities. Geothermal district heating is really a national source of pride. People often refer to it when you're over there, and currently they're paying the equivalent of about $1.64 per gallon of stove oil. So taking a look at some of these systems in an Alaska context, looking at Fairbanks, they have a similar problem to what Reykjavik used to face as far as pollution. Some days the particulate limits in Fairbanks are over 7 times the allowable limit. Population densities are actually pretty similar. Fairbanks is much colder than Reykjavik, as we looked at earlier, and Reykjavik is about 4 times the size of Fairbanks. Fairbanks obviously does not have the geothermal resource that Reykjavik has, so different sources of heat would be needed. These could be things like combined heat and power plants, some of the coal boilers that are already in use in downtown Fairbanks. There's a small district heating loop already in place. Lots of different things. There's even been some investigation of solar thermal during the spring season that could possibly be used. And in addition, in southeast Alaska, there's a lot of energy being put towards heat pumps, especially seawater sourced heat pumps, and these could be a possibility down there of things that could work in the future there. So some of the policies and incentives that might be necessary and helpful for these programs in Alaska. Taking a look at Europe and some of what they do, they actually treat their district heating infrastructure similar to how we treat our grid, and they give a feed-in tariff for people that are able to deliver clean heat energy to that district heating loop. Could also use the district heating loop as an incentive for people to improve or maintain high building efficiency standards. Obviously, this is only going to work if the actual district heating loop is cheaper than the conventional fuel that people are already using. And I think an important thing to remember with a district heating loop is that it allows a community to be more flexible with its fuel source. So rather than having all these individual boilers in everybody's house, if a community wants to change its fuel source from fuel oil to natural gas or something like that, you only need to modify that central plant which delivers heat, not everybody's home. And last but not least, Alaska is currently far wealthier than Iceland was when it began to invest in its district heating infrastructure. And I think for Alaska to be sustainable into the future and really to survive, we need to find a way to provide affordable heat and energy to our population. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I wanted to invite the students up, please.
Done I think one thing I'd like to do to kick off the discussion here is kind of talk about some of my lessons learned. I know some of the students talked about some of theirs. One of the things that really struck me, and especially, again, in having the opportunity to travel to some of the more rural areas of the country, is the deep tie and commitment they have to the land. That is really striking, and I think something that is difficult for us to really fully grasp, I think, as Americans and as Alaskans that are not Native Alaskans. Many of these people, especially when I started to travel to some of the more rural areas, they have a tie to the land that spans a pretty inconceivable timeline for us. They can talk about their ancestors and their tie to the lands and specific farm names and hills that span 1,000 years and go back to the saga time, which is, a very early recorded history of Icelandic history. And it's really fascinating to hear that. But what you realize with that is their tie and the commitment to the land over generations. They believe that their children and grandchildren and those children will be residents of Iceland and will have those same ties to that land. And so the level of commitment they're willing to make to that land is different than what I think, as Josh mentioned, the 7-year average residency of an Alaskan. It's very different, I think. And that's something that I learned from just being there and speaking with people there. Outmigration from rural areas, this is something that I really learned. I went to a community called Reykjavik, a community of 300 people in Iceland that has the highest per capita income in Iceland. It's in a very rich fishing ground that's between Greenland and Iceland. They're only 300 miles from Greenland in that area. Tiny, tiny community, highest per capita income in the entire country, and they are struggling with outmigration of their young people and asking the same kinds of questions that we ask as to whether their community is going to survive into the next generation. And to me, that's very, very interesting because at ASAP, we work a lot on rural energy issues and community energy issues. And so, my question that I came back here asking is, are we masking some of these social questions with the fact it's high energy costs? What are the challenges for rural Alaska? Is it that, or is it something larger than that? Is this a cultural shift at an international level where the people in Reykjavik that have the opportunity for some of the highest paying jobs in Iceland in their home communities are still leaving because they want to be part of a global community and they perceive that future to be in Reykjavik and not in Reykjavik? And so that I think was really something I learned from my time spent there. Icelanders are very aligned in thinking, and I think that was pretty interesting, and they're very forward looking. And so even in these rural communities that haven't necessarily benefited from things like the industry opportunities that we've seen that both Dominique and Josh spoke about, they are still really behind what the national interests are. And that was interesting to me because I expected to see differences of opinion in the rural areas, and they're unhappy because they're paying higher energy costs. They don't have access to geothermal district heating, so they're using electricity produced from geothermal and hydro for heating there. So there are higher costs associated with that. But they still believe in a future vision for their country that's pretty aligned with what you see at the national level. And they also are not looking backward. Iceland is still suffering from the banking crisis. There's still a lot of very serious impacts to individual residents from what happened to the country at that time. But they're not looking to assign blame. They're really looking forward. They're trying to figure out what their future opportunities are. They're not looking back. And I think that's pretty interesting. And it also follows along with something that I observed, which is a difference from the Norway policy tour and the Iceland policy tour, in that Iceland is a country of risk takers. And that was very interesting to me because Norway, in my perception, is not. When I went to Norway, I felt people were very calculated, very thoughtful. They put a lot of thinking into things, and they were very conservative in their thought process and their decision-making process. And in Iceland, I did not find that to be the case. I felt like Iceland was very willing to take risks for great rewards. And that's partially how they got into, I think, the banking crisis, but that's also how they've had some great successes in their nation. And for me, I found it to be pretty interesting because I think there's a lot of analogies to the United States with Iceland. And part of it is they are a nation of immigrants. And the people, the way I look at it is the people that had the guts to get in an open boat from Norway and immigrate to a country that they didn't even know they would be able to find once they got on that boat. Those were people that were really willing to take some risks then, and I think that's still sort of in their blood today. And I think in some ways that's still in our blood in the United States as well. So that's something that I think. They do believe in wealth distribution, so they're looking at a more egalitarian system in terms of offering free education to all their residents. They have a top-heavy tax structure there. So that's something that I think is interesting too. They're really looking at distributing wealth among the residents. And they have a strong work ethic that I think is interesting. It's much more aligned with the United States, with what we see here, than, in my opinion, with Europe, which my heritage is from Europe, so I'm fairly familiar with. They work hard. 80% of the residents are part of the workforce. They work early, they work hard, and they're very entrepreneurial. So those are some of my observations.
One thing I wanted to note, which it wasn't directly related to the whole energy tour, but was kind of a fundamental theme, was Iceland as a independent country and their currency in particular. And I think that subtle difference between us and obviously them played a big role in a lot of these opportunities, infrastructure development, the Kárahnjúkar Dam, banking crisis, for instance. And there's a lot of dynamics, I think, that go along with being a very small country and having your own currency in terms of investments and what that can do to interest rates and depreciation and such. So we could maybe discuss after the conversation here about that, but I thought that was a very, very interesting takeaway. And then the final lesson learned for me was just the very, very holistic, strategic energy plan the country as a whole has adopted. And I think that was just an underlying theme wherever we went in terms of how a project or a community or municipality district heating loop fit into this overall energy plan that the country has been developing. With that, I wanted to open this up, hopefully more informally, just for discussion for any questions you may have. Again, thank you very much to the students and their presentations. It's really great work on their part. Each of them are going to be formalizing their work into a paper, and we'll be having those on our website shortly. So feel free to stop by the front and get our web address and such, and those papers will be available for everyone. So with that, I guess I'll open it up, turn it over to the floor for any questions. Yes.
So I read about several years ago you're investing into the hydrogen economy with fuel cell buses and hydrogen fueling stations. Can you guys touch on that so much? What kind of a role do you see that playing in the future, and the general psyche towards the average Icelander's future energy viewpoint?
Yeah, that's a great question. So historically, Iceland's been really focused on this future hydrogen economy for their transportation sector. It's really the one primary energy sector that they're struggling with in terms of being more independent. And maybe someone here has more thoughts. My informal lessons from various discussions we had with ministers is that historically they're acutely interested in the hydrogen economy. My wife and I went there in 2008, right before the banking crisis, and that was a big deal. Just people talking about it. You'll see it advertised and such. It never really came up the entire time we were there as like one of these areas that they're really focusing on. We heard a little bit from the transportation ministry, I think, about some of their more of their interest in electric hybrid vehicles, that type of technology where they can use some of their readily available electricity to displace some of their transportation fuels. Of course, that doesn't necessarily address their fishing fleet, but I don't know if anyone else had any comments on that.
So your take is there's less emphasis now than there was 5 years ago?
Yeah, there's no question about that. I think one of the slides I've shown in the past, talking about Iceland as a model before I went over there, was that kind of a bumper sticker slide of how 98% of Icelanders are behind the idea of moving toward a hydrogen economy. But ultimately, Icelanders are pretty entrepreneurial, and they're going to do what makes economic sense and not just is technically feasible. And that's really the challenge, I think, for the hydrogen economy, for moving toward hydrogen for transportation. Hydrogen is a great energy carrier, but it's not very easy to store it in a dense form. And so for transportation applications, there's real challenges with hydrogen, and I think Iceland's recognized that, and so they've moved more toward this idea of using electric power for powering their transportation fleet. And that's where they're focusing right now.
Yeah, that's, excuse me, very interesting talk, and a lot of interesting points were brought up. In particular, it seemed that you were implying that there was a kind of a seamless thread between the government and the energy systems and the developments which were going on. And I was wondering if you could, at some point, this probably isn't the time to do it, if you could make some comment about the nature of government, whether it's unicameral, whether it's bicameral. I mean, exactly, it certainly Alaska has a lot more contention in itself. I mean, every day you just turn on the radio than what you're implying that Iceland has. And so it seemed as if their ability to put a plan in place and then execute it was better and more substantial and more well thought out than we. Secondly, we have the native community and the non-native community, and I think that there's a basic division in that, and the geography of Alaska offers another problem. So I'm just bringing up issues that I would like to hear on another talk. You all should just go back there and discuss these things.
I'm sure we would all volunteer for that. One thing that I should mention, and I don't know what all of you think, but actually the observations that we made, or I've made at least, about Icelanders being fairly aligned in their thinking and things like that, and their thought process and their politics, I don't actually think Icelanders would agree with that. A lot of what we heard is that the process has been messy and complex, and that there's been a lot of discussion and diverse ideas and thinking. But from our perspective, from my perspective as an Alaskan, they are more aligned and more streamlined in their underlying values and principles than we are here. So even though the process might have been messy and complex, ultimately they were able to find greater alignment than what at least I've been able to observe here in Alaska so far. I don't think they would define their own process, though, as being clean and efficient and aligned. That isn't the impression I got. That's my takeaway from it, not necessarily how they describe it. And I don't know if anyone else has a comment on that.
What for example, do most people in Reykjavik do for a living?
That's a great question.
I mean, you haven't said anything about that. We have bauxite plants, and you have energy systems, and all of these things going on. Are they all aligned to work in those areas, or is it just a regular urban economy?
I feel like in Reykjavik, there's obviously a lot of government jobs for both their federal government, their local government, or municipality. I feel like before the 2008 crisis, there was a lot of banks, and there isn't as many anymore. But it seems, just walking around Reykjavik, it was a very, very professional community. A lot of professionals hustling about. And so, but that's actually a great question, what the average employment is. But a lot of infrastructure with schools, hospitals. I'm sure the airport is a very huge employer. There's a major smelter pretty close to Reykjavik that I'm assuming is a major employer. A lot of the municipal services with energy and such. But one of your other previous question about the government interaction between government and the private sector in terms of development, I think is a really good question, and something we actually struggled with the entire trip, learning about like Landsphere, for instance, which is a government-backed organization that acts like a private company. They have government influence, but they don't let it influence their decisions. And so these types of things we struggled with the entire time. I don't know if Dominique, you wanted to talk more about that, or John.
The state-owned power company is a little bit strange because the government doesn't give them any money, but they do back all of their loans. So because the government will back their loans, that means that they can negotiate lower interest rates than any other company could get without it. And so in that sense, they're not private, but they do act like a privately owned company. The government does not do them.
So they have different institutions in Iceland
Yes.
than we have here. I mean, fundamental different structures in which you can put your energy or your money or whatever. So that
Yeah, I'd say the model for the utility is different than what we have here, definitely.
Yeah, one big difference to kind of follow up on that is, I mean, Alaska has a lot of its revenue from exporting energy. And you'd think Iceland, I didn't know if there's opportunities to export electricity to mainland Europe where the markets may support it. For example, in Tasmania, a lot of their hydropower goes up to southern Australia, 150 miles across Bass Strait. So is there any export of electricity that would perhaps get more capital than they could use locally for running industry when the markets allow?
They actually are looking at a cable that would run from Iceland to the mainland, but one of their biggest, the way they export electricity is through these energy-intensive products. 80% of the electricity generated in Iceland goes into producing aluminum, so that's how they export their energy right now. But there are plans, or they're thinking about it. There's nothing set in stone for an underwater cable to Europe.
I think like carbon trading at some point, it may be advantageous to reduce burning coal or other fossil fuels in Europe to buy green power, and that could create a market for them that might compete with aluminum or something.
Yeah, it's actually a really, it's a very debated topic, this potential for an HVDC line from Iceland to mainland Europe. One of the debates is around the price, because when they tap into the European market, their local prices very well could greatly increase just due to the prices on the other end. One of my misconceptions going in was that HVDC line was specifically for export of electricity. I think what we've heard during the trip is they have a lot of hydropower in country, and the line would actually allow them to utilize that hydroelectricity a lot better. So basically increase their ability to use their local hydro as opposed to a direct means of exporting electricity.
I want to add one thing too that I may be stepping out on a limb a little bit, so correct me if I'm wrong. But one thing I learned when I went up in this really remote area of Ísafjörður is that, and we did learn a little bit about this when we were in Reykjavik too, but practically it was more evident in Ísafjörður in the Westfjords. Icelandic individual consumers of electricity can actually buy their power from any individual electric producer in the country. It's a distribution network that's state-owned, so there's a cost associated with transmitting the power that you pay for. So if you're further away from, the main generation sources, you pay more for wheeling your power to your home. But if you think that you can get a better rate from this utility or that utility, you can buy your power from any utility that you want in the country, which is sort of interesting in my opinion. So if you were a Golden Valley on that grid, you could be buying power from Two Gas if you thought it was a better rate than Golden Valley. I mean, that's not a perfect analogy because, like Dominique was saying, it's not a totally analogous system. I thought that was actually really interesting. It's a competitive rate structure because it's a nationally owned electric grid.
Yeah. I'd like to follow up on my earlier question, and remember one of the things that was talked about when they first proposed the Alcoa plant in the east part of the country, the Fjarðal plant. What's that called, Fjarðal?
Yeah.
One of the things that they had talked about was, aluminum is carries about 6 times more energy per pound than diesel fuel does, and so they had talked about, industrial plants will pulverize aluminum and burn it in furnaces, or you can aluminum reacts directly with water to evolve hydrogen. And I wonder if anybody had mentioned that as a possible future driver for aluminum demand, and if they were looking at more aluminum plants with that in mind.
It's a great question. I don't know if any of us. My impression is that the Iceland is very little direct. Like the government has very little direct control or say in terms of where the aluminum is going. So they're basically just selling electricity, and they're totally separate from that business end of Alcoa or whoever else is there. So the supply from Brazil and the demand in Europe isn't really a part of their power purchase agreements or their discussions. So if it was feasible or it made sense, I'm sure that they're looking into it. But it would involve, I think, more concerted talks in terms of like what would happen with the produced aluminum from one of the smelters.
And I'll just add on to that, we've looked at that too. And the fact is that there is obviously energy that goes into pure aluminum production, and there are also ways through chemical processes that you can essentially generate energy in the form of heat from, using pure aluminum. But the question kind of becomes, what's the round trip efficiency of that process, and are there cheaper ways of getting energy? I think one of the things that we struggle with at the Alaska Center for Energy and Power is that often there are things that are technically feasible, but when you look at the economics, it's another question, and that's one of the reasons why we have folks like Dominique involved as part of our team, because we want to be looking at not just whether it's technically possible, because what you're describing is absolutely technically possible, but is it economic, and is it the best use of the resources that we have available to us?
So unfortunately, it's time to go. They need to clear the room for a movie, but we really appreciate everybody coming here and appreciate this discussion. And we'll stick around outside for a little while if you guys have further questions of our presenters, but I'd like to just thank them for their expertise and their time.